So we live in an era of innovation and technology and progress. We live in New York City. We're at the top of the pyramid. Everything gets invented here, and if it doesn't get invented here, we're one of the first ones to adopt it. We all have the iPhones or smartphones. We are all up on the newest stuff, and we are all looking forward to the future being better than it is today. We are so modern of a people, looking forward to the future being better. With science and progress, it's going to solve all of our problems. This is the way that modern people oftentimes think about the future. But there's another cross-current, another way that we can think about existence. We can think about the past, tradition, and heritage, old things, things that were here much longer before the iPhone came around. Now, sometimes people think that, well, the old is boring and obsolete. We need to move past these things. Some people are more future-oriented. Others are more past-oriented. You see, all of us decide whether or not we're going to emphasize the past or the future when we think about how we live our lives. And most people, kind of the trend in our society has been people moving from emphasizing the past towards emphasizing the future. You don't see that many people becoming Amish these days. But you do see Amish people modernizing and leaving their communities. It's kind of the same way with Orthodox Judaism. You don't see a whole lot of people becoming Orthodox, but you have a lot of Orthodox who then secularize or become Reform or even atheists. So they move in this direction. The majority moves to reject the past as unenlightened, as unscientific, as antiquated. And they see the past as something to be overcome. When they read the Bible, they say, oh, I'm just reading this ancient document from the Bronze Age made by some backwater people millennia ago. Who cares about these old documents? But then there are some people that, instead of emphasizing the future, emphasize the past. This is the minority, where they look at the past, they want to move toward it for truth, for morality, for wisdom. You see, the past is something to be protected, not something to move away from. And if we do emphasize the future too much, we are maybe tempted to not really have any source for these things. Well, you see, traditional Judaism is everything about the past. Yes, there are modern Orthodox who try to have some modern things integrated into their faith, but traditional Judaism is everything about the past. Traditional Judaism, that is Orthodox Jewish people, Haredi Jews, it's a quintessentially past-protecting religion. No truth claims about God or religion may be believed in unless it is in accordance with who? The sages, the rabbis, those who have protected the tradition from the past to keep it in the present. That means that the rabbis are the gatekeepers of all religious truth in traditional Judaism. Now, this is a very strong and enticing claim. Orthodox Jews consider their traditions to be unchanged for millennia. They haven't changed. Their traditions come from Sinai, given to Moses, and preserved by the rabbis. This argument of continuity and antiquity is a strong one, especially since, well, let's be honest, Messianic Judaism is a newcomer as an identifiable movement. Do we have any depth or heritage? And then our brothers and sisters in evangelical churches, sometimes shallow and don't really have many connections with historical liturgy and theology and creeds. You know, I grew up as a evangelical Christian, and I really couldn't tell you anything about anyone older than Billy Graham. He was kind of about, from ancient times. Yeah, I could read the Bible, but anyone older than Billy Graham, I had no connection to the heritage of my faith. Some evangelicals have converted to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy because of this perceived lack of continuity and antiquity. I don't know if you guys heard the news recently, but there's this guy named the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff. And he, just in the last 2 months, I believe, he converted to Eastern Orthodoxy because he believes that Eastern Orthodoxy is the original church of Jesus Christ. Some Messianic Jews and a handful of Gentiles convert to Orthodox Judaism because of this claim of continuity and antiquity. And this is Gabriel Sanders. This is a Gentile man who left Yeshua to attach himself to Orthodox Judaism because he wanted something that had heritage and antiquity. Once you become convinced that the tradition and teaching of another group is more authoritative than your own, you're not going to stay for very long. And that's the example of men like these. So I want to give a fresh look this morning on rabbinic authority. Are Orthodox rabbis the legitimate religious authorities over the Jewish people? Do the traditions of Orthodoxy go back to Sinai? And are Messianic Jews foolish for neglecting the halakha of the Mishnah and the Talmud as authoritative? These are big questions that every single Messianic Jewish believer either thought of before they came to faith or has to think about after they come to faith. And so let's talk about the Mishnah. What is the Mishnah? It is a record of the oral traditions of the rabbis who lived between 70 CE or 70 AD and 200. It was originally oral only. It's the oral law. But it was written down around 200 by Rabbi Judah HaNasi. It contains law, traditions, biblical interpretation, and wisdom. It has all kinds of things contained within it. Now it claims that the rabbis have the authority to give their laws contained in the Mishnah directly from Sinai. They claim to have that authority. And there is one part in the Mishnah that makes this claim the clearest. It's in the section of the Mishnah called Pirke Avot, the ethics of the fathers. It's a fantastic section in the Mishnah. If you read it, you will find so much wisdom, you will find so much heart. There are so many parallels between Pirke Avot and even Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. There are so many beautiful parallels. Well, Pirke Avot opens up with something that's called the chain of tradition. It claims that the rabbis have an unbroken chain of tradition that go all the way back to Moses. So this is the way it starts out. Moses received Torah at Sinai and handed it on to Joshua, Joshua to elders, and elders to prophets. This is summarizing the entire history of the Tanakh. And prophets handed it on to the men of the great assembly. Supposedly, these are the same men that show up in the book of Nehemiah after the return from exile. Simeon the righteous was one of the last survivors of the great assembly. Antigonus of Soko received the Torah from Simeon the righteous. And then Yosef ben Yotzer of Saradah and Yosef ben Yohanan of Jerusalem received it from them. And then it just keeps naming all of these different names of people who received the Torah. And you can try to place each one of these generations on a historical timeline. We are moving closer and closer to 70 AD with every single one of these generations. Hillel and Shammai received it from those before them. And then the final rabbi who received the Torah in this chain is Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who received it from Hillel and Shammai. Now, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, he was the top surviving rabbi who made it through the destruction of Jerusalem. So he lived through 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome, and he was the one who was responsible for really reformulating how Jewish people are supposed to practice Judaism. Because now there's no more temple. Now there's no more sacrifices. Now after 135 AD, you couldn't even set foot in Jerusalem as a Jewish person. So there was so much that had to be changed. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, in this chain of tradition, is claimed to be the one who has the official authority to make those kinds of changes. And then we have another passage in the Mishnah, not in Pirke Avot, but it gives this same chain of tradition with the same names, and it says that the first named in each one of these generations, so Hillel would be the first name, he was a patriarch. And the second one named, Shammai, he was the head of the court. What does that mean? It means, according to both Orthodox and Reform Jewish scholars, the patriarch was the president of the Sanhedrin. And the head of the court was the vice president of the Sanhedrin. So that means that the men on the chain of tradition had official authority because they ran the Sanhedrin. So that means that around 10 CE, the leaders of the Sanhedrin were Hillel and Shammai. And if you guys know the Mishnah at all, Shammai doesn't really win very often. Hillel wins all the time with his rulings. This is the historical claim of the foundational document in Orthodox Judaism about who had religious authority. So, the Sanhedrin was the highest court in the land of Israel. But the Sanhedrin was destroyed in 70 when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. The chain of tradition preserves the names of the Sanhedrin's leaders, and here's the kicker. They are all Pharisees. The chain of tradition is an argument for the continuity and the antiquity of the rabbis' authority. Why trust what the rabbis say? Because they have an unbroken chain of authority going all the way back to Moses. Now, why is that? It's because the rabbis are the heirs of the Pharisees. They claimed the Pharisees as their fathers. They say that they stand in the line of the men in the chain of authority. So, the rabbis of today are the direct spiritual descendants of the Pharisees in the chain. That means that without the chain, orthodoxy has nothing to hang from. And so here's the typical Orthodox argument about religious authority. Number one, Moses established courts of legal scholars. Number two, the highest court of legal scholars was the Sanhedrin. Number three, during the Second Temple period, the leaders of the Sanhedrin were Pharisees. Number four, Orthodox rabbis stand in direct line from these Pharisees and teach the same traditions. Number five, therefore, Orthodox rabbis have religious and legal authority over Judaism. Have you guys heard this kind of reasoning before? This is what they say. But we have a problem. We have a huge problem. No one but the Pharisees' heirs say that the Pharisees were the leaders of the Sanhedrin. This is a huge problem. Where are the priests? The rabbinic chain of tradition completely leaves the Levitical priesthood unmentioned. Why? That is a huge omission. Because if we look at the priests in the Tanakh, we see that they have the authority to teach the Torah to the people. That they are the members of the high court in Jerusalem. That they served as officers and judges. That the priests and the Levites were to be given tithes so that they could be strong in the Torah of the Lord. They were the Torah experts. Ezra the priest and the other priests and Levites taught the people the Torah after returning from exile. Ezra was not a rabbi, he was a priest. There are no rabbis in the Torah. You will not find that word ever used. There are sages and there are judges in the Tanakh, but they are often identified as Levites. So, we just did a survey of the Tanakh. But what happened after the Tanakh closed, after Malachi and 2 Chronicles ended? What about the 400 years in between those books and the coming of Yeshua? Those are called intertestamental Jewish sources. Well, we've got the book of Jubilees, which was actually found in Hebrew form in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is what it says. And the Levites will become judges and rulers and leaders for all the seed of the sons of Jacob. The word of the Lord they will speak righteously, and all of his judgments they will execute righteously. And they will tell my ways to Jacob and my paths to Israel. Who are the religious authorities according to Jubilees? The Levites, of whom some were priests. Sirach, another intertestamental book, says that Aaron the high priest was given the authority to judge and teach Israel the Torah. Philo, a first century Jewish philosopher, he says that if a lower judge cannot reach a decision on a difficult issue in the courts, then he should decline to judge the cases and send them up to more discerning judges. And who should be these but the priests, and the head and the leader of the priests? According to Philo, there is a supreme court in Judaism, and the head of that supreme court is the high priest. So according to all contemporary Second Temple sources, and I'm going to give you a couple more later, the leader of the high court was consistently the high priest. Consistently, every time. Here we've got Josephus, who is our primary historian for the time of the Second Temple. And he says the same thing in his book Against Appian. He says, "And where shall we find a better or more righteous constitution than ours?" That means the Israelite constitution, the Torah. "While this makes us esteem God to be the governor of the universe, and permits the priests in general to be the administrators of the principal affairs, and withal entrusts the government over the other priests to the chief high priest himself. These men had the main care of the law and of the other parts of the people's conduct committed to them. For they were the priests who were ordained to be the inspectors of all, and the judges in doubtful cases, and the punishers of those that were condemned to suffer punishment." He continues on. "There ought to be one temple for one God, for likeness is the constant foundation of agreement. This temple ought to be common to all men, because he is the common God of all men. His priests are to be continually about his worship, over whom he that is first by his birth is to be their ruler perpetually." What does that mean? The high priest, who's first of birth. "His business must be to offer sacrifices to God, together with those priests that are joined with him, to see the laws be observed, to determine controversies, and to punish those that are convicted of injustice. While he that does not submit to him shall be subject to the same punishment as if he had been guilty of impiety towards God himself." You do not go against what the high priest says, because the high priest has God's authority. Now Josephus continues on, and he gives, I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is his list of high priests who were the religious authorities over Israel during the Second Temple period. And I put them all on here just so you can see that this is a continuous list. There are even some dates here associated where we can plot each one of these high priests on a historical timeline, and this is a chain of authority. But this is not the rabbi's chain of authority. This is Josephus's chain of authority. And there's a couple that I want to highlight for you guys here. 3 that you may be familiar with. Ananias, son of Seth, called Annas in the New Testament. Joseph Caiaphas, high priest when Jesus was arrested. And then Ananias, son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was high priest in the book of Acts. Josephus mentions these same men, and they are confirmed as being the leaders of the high court in the New Testament. When you have 2 sources that are independent of each other, that both agree on the same thing, that is something that historians point to and say, see, this has a ring of truth to it. This seems to be verifiable. So, who led the Sanhedrin, say in 10 CE? According to Josephus in the New Testament, it was Annas, the high priest. According to the rabbis, it was Hillel and Shammai. Who ran the Sanhedrin? So who held official religious authority over Israel before 70, before the destruction of Jerusalem? According to all of these different works, it was the priests, with the high priest as their head. All of them say the same thing. And all of these are written, besides the Torah, all of these are contemporary reports that were written while the Second Temple stood. They saw it with their own eyes. They went to the courts and they knew who was in charge. They were eyewitnesses to the very things that they were writing down. But then on the right side, there's only one source that claims something else. Who held official religious authority over Israel before 70? The Mishnah says that the Pharisees did. And who says that? The rabbis, who are the Pharisees' own heirs. And they make this claim in the 2nd century, meaning after the temple was destroyed. Contemporary and tons of reports after the fact by the people who stand most to gain, and only one source who is saying this. So what's the problem? All Second Temple sources claim that the Levites and the priests were the authoritative teachers of Torah as established by God. All the sources which discuss the highest court, that is the Sanhedrin, describe the leader of that body as the high priest. The rabbis claim that the leaders of the Sanhedrin were the Pharisees, who were not high priests. So who has the history right? Now, the typical Orthodox position is to say that the rabbis are right. The rabbis have the right history. The Pharisees were the ones who were in charge of the Sanhedrin. But they don't even know about this problem with this chart. They don't even know that there's a contradiction here. Why? Well, 1, they trust what their rabbis tell them. Number 2 is that they don't read Jewish books from before 70 except for the Bible. So all of these books here, Josephus, Philo, the New Testament, they don't read those books. They don't think about the authoritative role of the priesthood in the Bible. In fact, many of the passages that talk about the Levites being the judges, they reinterpret them and say, no, it's the rabbis who are judges. They ignore the New Testament. They rarely read Josephus and Philo, which means that they basically cross all of these out. That is why they don't know that this is a problem. All they are doing is reading the Mishnah. And so if all you're doing is reading the Mishnah, that doesn't seem to be a problem. Of course, the Pharisees ran the Sanhedrin. But then there are some that try to take a synthesizing approach. They say, well, everybody's right here. Nobody's wrong. There isn't really a contradiction. What they say is, well, the priests and the Pharisees, maybe they shared authority in the Sanhedrin. But then someone else comes up with a different theory. Or maybe there was more than one Sanhedrin. There was a Pharisaic Sanhedrin, and then there was a priestly Sanhedrin. But then other scholars say, oh, no, I don't really like that solution. Maybe there was a political Sanhedrin and a religious Sanhedrin. But the problem is that none of the actual sources, none of these sources actually say any of this. They don't have a synthesizing approach. It's either or in the sources. So really, this solution only exists in the minds of a small handful of Jewish scholars. They're trying their best to make these sources agree with each other, but the sources really do not. Believing that the Pharisees controlled the Sanhedrin only makes sense if we limit ourselves to the books on the shelves of an Orthodox synagogue. That's really the only way that it makes sense. But there are many other Jewish books that did not make it past the gatekeepers of Orthodoxy. Why? Perhaps because they did not support rabbinic authority. Once we are exposed to these books outside of the rabbi's own canon, outside of the synagogue library, it becomes increasingly difficult to trust the rabbi's claims to authority. For instance, the Jewish Encyclopedia, written by Reformed Jews, they don't have any problem highlighting that this is a problem. In the entry on the high priest, the Jewish Encyclopedia says, the high priest was the presiding officer of the Sanhedrin. This view conflicts with the later Jewish tradition according to which the Pharisaic TANAKH, that means the men that were on that chain of tradition, are at the head of the academies presided over they presided over the great Sanhedrin. However, a careful reading of the sources, meaning the sources on the left side of that chart, a careful reading of the sources, as well as the fact that in the post-Maccabean period, the high priest was looked upon as exercising in all things, political, legal, and sacerdotal or religious, the supreme authority, shows it to be almost certain that the presidency of the Sanhedrin was vested in the high priest. This is a Jewish source claiming that the right side of that chart, the Mishnah, is getting it wrong. We've got another professor here, Philip Alexander, professor of post-biblical Jewish literature. He says, the priests were in direct competition with the rabbis, whose authority rested solely on their expertise in the law. The key difference between the rabbis and the priests then was not about the centrality of the Torah, but about who had the authority to interpret it. The priests were on very strong ground because the Torah clearly assigned the task to them, not to the scribes. It may have been to try to counter this that the Rabbinate developed the fiction of the oral Torah, which tried to trace rabbinic tradition back to Sinai and give it the same status as the written Torah. Another scholar of early Judaism, Lester Grabb, he mentions a couple fellow scholars. He says, as Goodblatt, Ephron, and others have demonstrated, the Sanhedrin of rabbinic literature is an idealized creation of the rabbis. There may be some genuine memories of Second Temple times, but as a whole, it does not fit the society of Judea or Judaism before 70. Once this is recognized, many of the difficulties with trying to find the historical Sanhedrin disappear. So, this is the big problem. By establishing the Mishnah, the chain of tradition, as the official history of Judaism, and by throwing out the New Testament and Josephus and all those other works, the Jewish people were effectively cut off from knowing the truth about their own history. What was the truth? They used to be led by priests, and the rabbis usurped their power. They used to be led by priests, and the rabbis usurped their power. The rabbis are a new breed of religious leader. They don't have political authority. They're not kings. They don't have cultic or sacrificial authority. They are not priests. They have no prophetic authority. They are not prophets. Those are biblical categories from the Tanakh. The rabbis are not those. They solely claimed legal authority. They are lawyers of religion. Orthodox Judaism can certainly appeal to continuity and antiquity regarding the origins of their tradition. They can. But there's a problem. The origins don't go any further back than 70. That's really where the continuity and the antiquity really begins. It was not rabbis, rather Levitical priests, who were intended by God to be the religious authorities over Israel. The rabbinical court is not supposed to be the final authority. The high priest was established by God to be that final authority. In other words, God never demoted the high priest, only men did. So what about the high priesthood today? Jewish people used to look to the high priest as their supreme religious authority. They don't do it anymore. They used to. Today, when Jewish people think of priests, they probably think of Catholics with big long robes on. It's a foreign concept, priesthood, priest. It's not a Jewish thing to think about. But that is the effect of the rabbis erasing the priesthood from Judaism. But what if God still requires Israel to follow a high priest today? He never took that requirement away. What if, even today, He still requires that? See, Yeshua is our great high priest. So let's read from the book of Hebrews. It is witnessed of Yeshua, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. This makes Yeshua the guarantor of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Jewish people may say today, well, we don't have a high priest. The Levites, they lost their authority. The Romans came in and destroyed the priesthood. Yeah, we have Kohanim that are around today. We got Mr. and Mrs. Cohen. They say that they're from the priestly line, but they don't have any authority today because, well, the Romans, they cut that off. That is what Romans is saying is a weakness of the Levitical priesthood. You see, because they're prevented by death. You have to have a priest around in order to follow the priest. Yeshua does not have that problem because he rose from the dead. Let's keep reading in Hebrews. Go back a couple chapters. Hebrews 4. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. Jesus, Yeshua, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. God has not left his people Israel without a high priest. So in closing this morning, remember, Once you become convinced that the tradition and teaching of another group is more authoritative than your own, you will not stay long. And many Orthodox Jewish people think that they have the high ground here. They really do think that as long as they can convey their antiquity, their continuity, then we will just come converting back to Orthodox Judaism. But that is not the case. May this be true for religious Jewish people when they hear Yeshua's teaching and when they compare it to the rabbis. May they feel the pull of continuity and antiquity when they see that he is the true high priest. That there has not been any change from priests to rabbis. That there is still a high priest who sits at God's right hand, who is our religious authority. May we grow in confidence that Yeshua, our great high priest, is more authoritative than the Orthodox rabbis. And may we use this knowledge to explain to religious Jewish people that their true authority stands ready to lead them today.